know what capitalism is? Get fucked.
Now, you're not naive enough to think we're living in a democracy, are you, buddy? It's the free market.
When people on the left of center or even libertarians point out that our current systems of government are not very democratic, most people are just like, well, duh. The fact that shit's is pretty obvious. But people think this for very different reasons. Rampant inequalities and the increasing blatant influence of the billionaire class on electoral politics have been exacerbated since the 1970s amidst the destruction of the welfare state and the ascendancy of the global neoliberal order. You know, the era ushered in by Reagan, Thatcher, and the usual suspects often pointed to by leftist critics. Now, regardless of which culprit is scapegoated, this rampant inequality has given rise to a wide variety of confusing narratives among the conspiratorial right, and simplistic solutions among the liberal left. Both attempt to make sense of the problem in terms of a privileged elite controlling the government, albeit in very different ways.
Top 1%.
Globalists.
Suck the flesh off your head.
And the notion that a powerful elite exists undeniably has truth to it. The existence of a corporate and political elite are most overt in countries like the United States, where the corporatization of politics is most blatant. Probably the most famous scholar who wrote about this phenomenon is C. Wright Mills in his famous book called The Power Elite, which came out in the 1950s, the so-called golden age of welfare capitalism. We don't gotta summarize this book because C. Wright Mills basically just gives more sophisticated evidence and sociological research for something that we already know.
People are stupid.
It's true.
Most people aren't stupid, and the average person you know probably thinks that the government is run by rich people, but they don't exactly know how. When it comes to fixing our governments, most people think that the main problem revolves around campaign finance. Most people think that the problem with modern democracy under capitalism is corporate lobbying, or the ideologies of neoliberalism. And both of these suspicions generally have some truth to them. But in reality, the problem goes way deeper. Let's say you fix corporate lobbying, drain the swamp of corrupt politicians, and replace the crony neoliberalism with the social democratic welfare capitalist utopia that many social democrats who are left of center dream of restoring.
Liberal. Liberal, 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 happy fun, la la la.
What if I told you that the system would still be rigged against the vast majority of people, even if campaign finance and corporate lobbying were restricted, and if the rich had to pay high taxes? It appears self-evident to many people that the solution involves campaign finance reforms to get money out of politics, or a political purge of undemocratic institutions in the state to drain the swamp. After all, is it not obvious that a state ruled by people from a privileged socioeconomic class would prioritize the interests of the people from that class? By this logic, the state could be ruled for the interests of the many if it was ruled by anti-establishment individuals who did not belong to the privileged classes and rejected the financial support of corporations. However, there are certain historical tendencies that problematize these assumptions. For starters, ever since property requirements have been lifted for electors and politicians, the governments of capitalist societies have often not been governed by the wealthiest individuals of society, and have often been ruled by public officials who don't own much capital, if any at all, and are not part of the bourgeoisie. There have been various cases of elected populist governments governed by people who explicitly reject corporate ties, with many socialist parties being elected to government in liberal democracies like France, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Sweden, Greece, and many others. Not to mention the various self-proclaimed socialist parties in South America, some of which still exist today. And granted, many of these socialist parties are really just social democratic parties, but still, much of them were comprised of members who did not own much capital, if any at all, and were certainly not part of the ruling class. Yet there's this prevailing sense among many people that not much changed. Yet in just about all of these cases, the dominant property-owning classes were able to maintain their positions in the class hierarchy despite having to make some short-term concessions, like higher taxes and regulations. In certain instances, some of these socialist parties even implemented austerity programs that were deeply unpopular with the working class, with François Mitterrand and François Hollande in France being notable examples. So what gives? Why do most governments everywhere seem to govern in favor of the wealthy few at the expense of the working class? Well, the answer is,
It's the economy, stupid. It's the economy, stupid.
the root cause of the problem involves the capitalist system itself. But what does this mean? What does it mean to be anti-capitalist? And wait, why is capitalism bad again? Aside from the more obvious reasons, like inequality, the exploitation of labor, time, energy, and the destruction of the environment. Now, before we get into the more overlooked problems with capitalist democracy that most critics miss, I already know that there's going to be some wise guy in the comments section saying, well, you live in capitalism, yet you make money? Hypocrite much?
You don't like capitalism, yet you exist!
Yes, like all of us, I also have to find a way to make ends meet in capitalism. And honestly, I don't feel bad whatsoever about working with a service that helps protect me from private companies trying to phish my data. And that service is Aura, the sponsor of today's video. An all-in-one service that can help protect your privacy and prevent companies from phishing your data. Your government name, email, home address, health records, and information about family are probably all out there if you aren't careful. As a result, data brokers can easily sell your personal information to scammers, spammers, and anyone else who might want to target you. But I don't gotta worry about that anymore ever since I started using Aura. Aura shows me which data brokers are selling my information and automatically submits opt-out requests for me. Cleaning up your information not only helps reduce the amount of spam you get, but it also can help protect you from hackers who could potentially use this information to access your social media accounts, bank accounts, or other sensitive information. And the best part is, I don't gotta spend time worrying about this because Aura pretty much just protects me in the background from threats that I don't even see. Oh, and you also get access to a bunch of other cool features like an antivirus, a VPN, password management, parental controls, identity theft insurance, and more without having to download a billion different apps. It's a super convenient all-in-one service at a relatively affordable price. I value my privacy, and if you value yours, you can sign up using my link in the description, aura.com/onedime, where you can get a 14-day free trial. Now back to the video. A lot of people claim to be anti-capitalist, but they are often just anti-bourgeois, who are justifiably against inequality or just simply hate the decadence of rich people. Ah yes, another YouTuber telling you why capitalism is bad. What makes this one any different?
Have to promote general social concern, unless materialism can help people.
Well, instead of making a 1-hour video essay on why some Disney movie is anti-capitalist, classic breadtube, I think we ought to understand exactly why capitalism is bad and how it actually works, particularly the specific ways in which it undermines democracy, and not just by simply having rich people being able to influence the government. Now you're on the internet trying to explore how capitalism works, and the average Marxist will tell you just to read Karl Marx's Das Kapital. But ain't nobody got time for that, and likely they haven't read it themselves.
Start puffing, boy.
That's too fucking long, so just read Wage, Labor, and Capital. Pretty easy to understand. But for all you newbies out there, I highly recommend the book titled The People's Guide to Capitalism. It's much more simple and gives you an overview of some of the main ideas. And if you're too lazy to even do that, then just watch one of these videos. There are a lot of nuances to Marx's work and a lot of different interpretations which get very, very complex. But as to how capital works itself, some of the most basic ideas can be broken down in that book. Now, how the capitalist economy works is one thing, but how capitalism works as a system of power and a social order at the political level is where shit gets a lot more complex.
The capitalist class rules. It does not govern. Karl Kautsky.
Despite the blatantly close relationship between corporate power, the democratic process, and government policy, most pronounced in countries like the United States, the privileged classes of society do not need to actually rule the capitalist state directly or even indirectly for it to still function disproportionately to the benefit of their long-term interests. In other words, the ruling class does not actually need to rule the government in order to rule society. The notion of a powerful corporate elite pulling the strings can explain the actions of governments like Canada, Sweden, Germany, and various other countries, which are still capitalist states, yet often ruled by politicians who do not actually have direct corporate ties. Identifying the class background and corporate ties of actors governing the system as the cause of the state's biases towards the interests of the privileged classes presupposes that the removal of such corporate affiliations would entail the capitalist state no longer having this class disposition, thereby allowing it to be wielded by the subordinated classes, the many. While it may seem like common sense, this assumption is inaccurate, and is based on a mistaken conception of how the state works, which identifies the system's effects as the root causes of those effects. What this conception misses is that the objective socioeconomic relations built into the capitalist economy and the institutional structures of the capitalist state reproduce each other and interrelatedly perpetuate the relations of class domination irrespective of the status or intent of the agents governing the state. As we will see, the capitalist system, its mode of production and state, contain deeply ingrained structures that reproduce its overarching social relations of class domination and shape the individual actors who fill the roles of different social classes, which ends up reproducing a type of state which perpetuates the capitalist system, regardless of the class background of those ruling the government. But first, it's important to clarify how we define social classes. Contrary to how most people define rich and poor, for Marxists, class is not based on the relative sizes of income, which is really just an effect of the relations of ownership. Generally, in Marxist theory, class is defined principally, but not exclusively, by one's place in the production process. Generally speaking, for Marxists, if an individual derives most of their income from wage labor, they are a working class person. Whereas if they live primarily from the profit extracted by the labor of others, or the rents collected from their property, they constitute part of the capitalist property-owning class, what is known as the bourgeoisie, which itself can be divided into different fractions. But class theory can be really complicated, and there's a lot of nuances. But personally, I'm not a big fan of the bourgeoisie and proletariat distinction, which is seen as slightly outdated. Even at the end of Capital Volume 3, Marx tries to define what classes are and the page is blank. He never was able to finish Capital. Thus, there isn't really a definitive theory of class in Marx. Many Marxian thinkers after Marx ended up adding a lot to Marxist class theory. I personally like the definition used by the Marxist thinker Nikos Poulantzas, whose work informed the script of much of this video. His most rigorous books, like State Power and Socialism and Political Power and Social Classes, are extremely challenging to read. What you're watching is meant to be more accessible for a broader audience.
Are you not entertained?
But if you're curious to see a more academic portrait of the key ideas that this video is based on, then you should check out my essay on Nikos Poulantzas published in Cosmonaut magazine. Poulantzas prefers to use the terms dominant classes and dominated classes. This is because they are different fractions of the capitalist class who often have conflicting interests. Contrary to popular belief, Marx did not see the bourgeoisie, aka the capitalist class, as a monolithic class. The capitalist class is typically divided into industrial, commercial, and financial fractions, among others. Within competing sections of the dominant classes, there are often huge tensions, not just due to competition, but due to having very different economic interests.
One night I'm gonna come to you inside of your house, wherever you're sleeping, and I'm gonna cut your throat.
For instance, today there are tensions between the fossil fuel industry, oil, gas, coal, etc., and the clean energy industry. One can also see tensions between big tech and traditional news media, as well as tensions between big tech itself.
You're human, and I was human. I am human, still. I am not a lizard.
Additionally, although less prevalent nowadays, there are also dominant classes from older modes of production that still exist, like the aristocracy, big landowners, and the nobility. In fact, in England, many of the richest individuals are still lords and people from aristocratic families. And the broader term dominated classes is often better than working class because there are various oppressed classes, not just the working class, including the peasantry, the lumpen proletariat, and depending on where you stand, even the petite bourgeoisie, small business owners. And plus there's a bunch of unpaid work like care work, stay-at-home moms, etc. That's why it's easier to juxtapose the dominant classes with the dominated classes, as the dominated classes are all characterized by their subordination to another class. And dominant classes disproportionately possess the most power. And what does power mean here? Power to do what? Power just for the sake of power? Well, according to Marxists like Poulantzas, power can be defined as the capacity of a social class to realize a specific objective interests. One of the intrinsic functions of the capitalist state is to organize the dominant classes while disorganizing the dominated classes, and preventing them from becoming a unified political force. The general function of the capitalist state is to maintain cohesion and a sort of temporary unity in a class-divided society, to essentially prevent class conflict from getting out of control. You can already find this in the works of Marx, Engels, and Lenin. But what we often forget is that even the dominant classes can't always achieve unity by themselves.
Will you shut up, man?
The state facilitates a contradictory unity between the dominant classes both at the level of governance and at the level of political representation in government. It's there to represent the different factions of the dominant classes, while making compromises to the dominated classes, if need be.
No fighting. No fucking fighting. Now fighting. No fucking fighting! Good. Get the fuck in.
This involves what Antonio Gramsci called an unstable equilibrium of compromises. It's not just the conflict between the upper and lower classes. Tensions among the dominant classes can be quite significant politically, and they can even lead to a transformation in the form of regime that a capitalist system takes. If there is a crisis of unity between social classes and/or the dominant class fractions behaving in ways that threaten the stability of the capitalist system as a whole, then the state will reassert its power over them to put them in check.
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
For example, this was seen in the policies of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, which simultaneously saved the capitalist class from their own self-induced misfortunes during the Great Depression and contained the burgeoning class conflict that ensued by passing the New Deal and imposing tax and regulation policies which many rich people did not like, which stabilized the long-term interests of finance capital. I talked about this in one of my oldest videos called Why Billionaires Prefer Democrats. It's not a perfect video, but it explains this phenomenon well. Although in such instances like social democracy, it may appear as though the dominant classes have lost power, it is sometimes the indispensable means of maintaining the hegemony of the dominant classes. Even in cases like social democracy, the state tends to sooner or later re-establish the relationship of forces in favor of the bourgeoisie. There are many examples of this in Europe from the 1980s up until the early 2000s. When various countries with social democratic or socialist parties in power ended up implementing neoliberal austerity policies, such as
Sweden, Portugal, France, Greece.
So back to the main question of the video. Why exactly does the state seem to almost always act in favor of the interests of the dominant classes sooner or later, even when it is ruled by a democratically elected social democratic or even socialist party? While most people think that the problem with democracy is just campaign finance, corporate lobbying, and the class backgrounds of those who enter politics, the correspondence between the government's policy and the interests of the dominant classes is not actually based primarily on personal ties. This might at first seem like a bewildering claim, especially when considering the countless examples of instances where who governs a state is heavily influenced by which political actors get the most financial support from the dominant classes. And the policies implemented by capitalist states are often guided by lobbyists and professionals who are recruited by members of the dominant classes. Even in countries that have much stricter campaign finance regulations compared to the United States, such as Canada and the UK, corporate lobbying still influences public policy, although to a lesser extent. And while most countries in West Europe have very strict campaign finance laws, they are still governed by a corporatized undemocratic body, which is the EU, a highly oligarchic institution that is tied up into the interests of corporate elites and decides the fate of European nations with very little accountability to the people who actually live in them. As a result, it might seem like common sense that the problem here is one of corporate elites influencing the government. In his masterful work on the structure of the capitalist state, the Marxian theorist Nikos Poulantzas shows how the government's general bias towards the interests of the privileged classes can't simply be explained by things like corporate meddling. He poses the following question, quote,
"Why, in general, does the bourgeoisie seek to maintain its domination by having recourse precisely to the national popular state, to the modern representative state with all its characteristic institutions? For it is far from self-evident that the bourgeoisie would have chosen this particular form if it had been able to tailor a state to its requirements. While the bourgeoisie continues to derive many benefits from such a state, it is by no means always contented with it, any more than it was in the past."
In other words, if the top capitalists supposedly controlled the state, then they would probably design a system with far less restrictions and impediments to their immediate interests. Like, for example, most corporations probably would prefer a corporate tax to be 0, not 25%. And if capitalists had the exact system that they wanted, they would probably go for some sort of anarcho-capitalism, or at the very least, a system in which state involvement in the economy is reduced to a bare minimum. But of course, they would still want the state to intervene whenever the capitalist system collapses, so that they can get bailed out. And if capitalists had it their way, they would probably privatize almost every industry that there is. Given the number of regulations, taxes, and other bureaucratic roadblocks to capital that still exist, there are still clearly limits to the amount of influence that the capitalist classes have over the state.
And they used to be able to let you poop and you could poop all that everything that you wanted to. And then they started putting in the restrictions and the rules and regulations.
As seen in the cases of social democracy and fascism, capitalist economies have seen the rise of popular governments not controlled by the dominant classes, who often engage in openly hostile conflict with them. The question we should be asking is, why do the vast majority of governments with a capitalist economy more often than not still act in ways that benefit the long-term interests of the dominant capitalist class, even when members of this class are not actually controlling the state?
How, Sway?
Don't get me wrong, campaign finance and lobbying are very important. However, this video intends to show that the affiliation between corporate power and high state officials is not the root cause of the government's bias towards the interests of the dominant classes, but rather it is more so an effect of the capitalist system itself. In particular, the structures of the division of labor within the capitalist mode of production, and the legal codes of the capitalist state. While many of the points being made in this video are said by Lenin in State and Revolution, Lenin still makes the mistake of characterizing the state as an instrument of class rule. And this framing is also used by Marx and Engels at times, like in the Communist Manifesto with the famous line that, quote, "The executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie." The Marxist theory of the state has since been elaborated by other Marxist figures like Gramsci, Althusser, and Poulantzas. If we conceptualize the state as an instrument of class rule, we thereby assume that the ruling class must be controlling it, either directly or indirectly. As we will see, the root cause of the disposition of states to rule in favor of the wealthy is not so much the class backgrounds or political ideologies of the politicians who govern it, but rather the matrix of socio-economic structures already inscribed into the capitalist economy. Capitalism should be understood as a matrix. Most of you probably heard this term from the famous science fiction movie that depicts a dystopian future in which humans are unknowingly trapped inside a simulation called The Matrix, created by intelligent machines that aim to distract humans in a dream world while harvesting their bodies as an energy source. I think the most interesting thing about this series is that it's not immediately clear who, if anyone, actually rules the Matrix. However, the word matrix is indeed a real term that has been used in mathematics and by theorists in the social sciences. A matrix typically refers to an environment, social structure, or a surrounding material in which something develops. The reason why most countries with a capitalist economy have governments that act more in favor of the rich than in favor of the poor is not necessarily because they are ruled by politicians controlled by a wealthy establishment, or a shadowy cabal of international elites like the World Economic Forum. Instead, the tendency for governments to act in favor of the wealthy at the expense of the working class, and the class affiliations of the politicians who rule the state, should be seen as byproducts of the capitalist matrix, rather than its architects.
Alright, I get it!
As we will see, regardless of who is in charge at the front of the steering wheel, and even if a popular government made up of individuals with no corporate ties is elected, the vast majority of the working population is still structurally barred from influencing the democratic government in any significant way, due to the social relations already built into the capitalist economy. Now that might sound unnecessarily complex. Let's unpack the capitalist matrix step by step, starting with the division of labor. The economic dominance of the capitalist class is already built into the capitalist economy itself. Most of us already know about Marx's theory of exploitation, that workers are paid less than the value that they generate for the owner. But here we are more interested in the forms of capitalist coercion that impact society politically. The primary form of coercion that most people experience under capitalist society is not overt state coercion, although that does happen a lot, but rather it is the mute compulsions of having to adapt to the economic demands of capitalism and civil society. This is the private tyranny of being exploited by a boss, having to work 9 to 5 just to earn money to be able to exist, live in a box, eat food, and maintain relationships, let alone start a family. This is not to say that having to work to survive is unique to capitalism. What makes work under capitalism unique are the conditions of work and the division of labor within it. Within the capitalist mode of production, wage laborers, aka the direct producers, are separated from their means of production. They are totally dispossessed of their means of subsistence and own nothing but their labor. Some on the upper end of the wage-earning class may have 401ks or some savings and own a little bit of capital, and they might own their house. But this hardly makes them part of the capitalist class, as they spend most of their life earning their money through labor. And their relationship in the larger socioeconomic hierarchy is still one in the working class. We tend to call the better paid portion of the working class the middle class, although the so-called middle class is structurally still within the dominated classes. Now, from the very start, the division of labor, for the most part, effectively excludes the vast majority of powerless wage laborers from partaking in the ruling of the state. the creation of its laws, the enforcement of those laws, and the production of ideology and established knowledge that rationalizes this system, justifies its hierarchies, and legitimizes their power. The class divisions generated by the capitalist mode of production between those who live off wage labor and those who live off the labor of others structurally limits what type of people have access to the governance of the state and the enforcement of its laws. In addition to these class divisions and the general division of labor, there is also the division between manual labor and intellectual labor. The governance of virtually all of the state's institutions requires intellectual laborers and effectively excludes manual laborers from the process altogether. The state's institutions and their agents at all levels, which include not only the governing class, but the professional managerial class, comprised of managers and administrators, bureaucrats, as well as legal professionals, judges, policy advisors, and even administrators of the repressive state apparatuses like the police and military, effectively have a permanent monopoly on knowledge, which determines the functions of state organization and leadership, which sets and reproduces the norms and rules of state organization and their functions. In other words, the vast majority of people who partake in intellectual labor are socialized into the prevailing ideology and the official established knowledge that is deemed legitimate. Those who are being trained for intellectual labor and to a lesser extent manual labor are inevitably socialized into this capitalist mode of existence, either unconsciously, reluctantly, cynically, or just out of practical necessity. You gotta earn a living, so you just adapt to the ways of the system and its ideology. And adopting the system's dominant ideologies can help rationalize one's existence in the world, giving one a reason for why they do what they do, and that their suffering and subjugation is just, or simply unchangeable. You often hear people say, "That's life. That's just how life is. There's no alternative."
Thanks for watching. Good night, and always remember, that's life.
The assumptions about our socioeconomic system that we often take for granted and consider to be common sense are usually the very expression of the dominant ideology, which conceals that society's contradictions, and the less overt forms of coercion. This process of ideological socialization into the official established knowledges also applies to the game of representative democracy, which most politicians and political parties adapt to, as well as all of their intellectual laborers, like bureaucrats, advisors, policy experts, etc. Manual laborers are systematically precluded from influencing any of these areas, because if they were to try to partake in the system and try to change it from the inside, they would then become intellectual laborers, and have to be educated and socialized into the dominant logic. Trust me, I went to the exact sort of school geared towards producing these sort of bureaucrats and policy experts. Some people who are socialized into this dominant logic don't actually accept it, but succumb to it cynically, or out of necessity. Nikos Poulantzas eloquently sums up this process of socialization and the monopoly on knowledge in this following passage.
Capitalist law thus gives expression to the process whereby the agents of production are entirely dispossessed of their intellectual powers to the benefit of the dominant classes and of their state. In this broad sense, every state agent, every parliamentarian, politician, policeman, officer, judge, barrister, lawyer, civil servant, social worker, and so on, is an intellectual to the extent that he is a man of law, who legislates, knows the laws and regulations, and applies them in concrete ways. No one should be ignorant of the law. That is the fundamental maxim of the modern juridical system, in which no one but state representatives are able to know the law. This knowledge required of every citizen is not even a special subject of study at school, as if everything were done to keep him in ignorance of what he is supposedly obliged to know. The maxim therefore expresses a relationship whereby the popular masses, whose ignorance of the law's secrets is built into this law and juridical language itself, remain dependent upon and subordinated to state functionaries as the makers, protectors, and appliers of the law.
Given that manual laborers are pretty much excluded from legal state apparatuses, and to a large extent are even literally excluded from possessing knowledge of the law, it is not a coincidence then that the law is intrinsically biased in favor of the dominant classes. This reality is masked by the formal, impersonal character of the legal system that says that all citizens are equal before the law, and that no one is above the law. While most of us would prefer a legal system like this compared to a more archaic one, many of us know all too well that this isn't actually true. And in practice, the rich are able to circumvent the law much more easily, with the right lawyers and connections. Yet while many people cynically disavow this ideology, for the most part they act in their everyday lives as though they believe it. Unlike feudal systems and serfdom, where economic exploitation is explicitly political and people are part of communities rather than individual citizens, the state in capitalist society has a unique level of relative autonomy from the economy and its dominant classes. In feudal systems, the dominant classes of the economy were also the dominant classes politically. However, in modern capitalist states, the governing political class is not always the same as the dominant economic class. As we stated before, the capitalist class can still rule society without ruling the government, as their main source of power lies within the private economy of civil society. Believe it or not, but the notion of an economy considered separately from the political is a fairly modern abstraction. For now, it is safe to say that while a proto-form of capitalism existed in the Italian city-states and was tried in the Dutch Republic, capitalism as we know it was not secured until its implementation in England, which is when capitalism became the dominant mode of production, through the adoption of liberal constitutions that guaranteed property rights and reproduced capitalist social relations through measures such as enclosures,
Leave them animals be! This is the common land!
Which forcefully dispossessed peasants from their land, forcing them into wage labor. In other words, capitalism was not implemented peacefully. Marx famously writes about this in Capital in the writings on primitive accumulation. There have been various books written on the subject, such as Ellen Wood's Origin of Capitalism, or the book called The Long 20th Century. This separation between the economic and political also went hand in hand with the rise of modern democracy, in which the system's authority is justified by an impersonal form of legitimacy based on the will of the people, as opposed to divine right. This allows modern states with a capitalist economy to present themselves as representing the nation's general interests, and the laws it imposes take on a seemingly neutral character. Marx and Engels talk about this a lot in their book The German Ideology. While participation in modern constitutional democracy was originally restricted just to property owners, the gradual political struggles towards full universal suffrage forced modern states to undergo a massive rhetorical revolution, whereby all the elected representatives had to at least pretend that what they are doing is for the interests of all, the general interests of society, the nation, the whole people, as opposed to ruling disproportionately in favor of the dominant classes of society. The separation between the economic and the political, and the whole ideological rhetoric regarding the general interest, obscures and depoliticizes the class relations of the capitalist economy, which reproduces a division between those who live off manual labor, the owners of capital who profit from it, and intellectual labor. These are the core structures of the capitalist mode of production, which in turn reproduce the classist disposition of the modern state. The state functions as an organizer of the labor process by establishing and regulating the socio-legal terrain in which commercial market encounters take place. For example, private property law and various economic liberties are engraved into most modern constitutions of states overseeing a capitalist economy, which are typically upheld by a separate autonomous judiciary capable of preventing the sitting governments from changing these codes. In her book titled The Code of Capital, the legal scholar Katharina Pastor provides many in-depth examples of the class bias of capitalist legal systems. Although not a Marxist, surprisingly, she demonstrates the crucial role of the legal code in systemically upholding the dominance of property owners, and arrives at the conclusion that it is virtually impossible to address the root causes of inequality without radically restructuring the institutional legal framework of capitalist states. The inherent class domination built into the system is ideologically veiled by the state's neutral appearance as the guarantor of the nation's public interests. However, the notion of the general interests of the people does express a real fact. The state really does have to look out for the interests of all sectors of society to a limited extent in order to maintain the system's stability. Overall, the state in capitalist society tends to act in favor of the dominant capitalist classes, yet there are cases where the state must act in defiance of the short-term interests of the dominant classes and make material concessions to the interests of the subordinate classes. The state may even implement policies that are actively detrimental to the short-term economic interests of particular agents within the dominant classes, insofar as they are viewed as being necessary for securing social cohesion, aka managing class conflict. This occurs with most, if not all, capitalist states to varying degrees. But the most notable examples are fascism and social democracy. In both of these cases, the state is ruled by individuals who are usually not from the dominant classes, and especially in the case of social democracy, the state has, at times, been ruled by people who are not allied with the dominant classes at all, and are even hostile to them. Social democracy, or in its lighter form, welfare capitalism, involves concessions to the dominant classes to ameliorate class tensions and stimulate economic growth, while fascism involves a dictatorship over capital and the dominant classes. Yet in both cases, the long-term hegemony of the capitalist classes over the subordinate classes remains relatively unchanged. In other words, the capitalist state does not directly represent the economic interests of the dominant classes, but rather their long-term political interests. That is, their overall dominance over the subordinate classes. In doing so, the state functions as the guardian of the capitalist mode of production as a whole, by securing the conditions for its survival, which in turn, as we mentioned, perpetuate the class disposition of the state that helps, in turn, reproduce the capitalist system. It's a reciprocal relationship. The logical conclusion of the analysis presented in this video is that any political project that attempts to address the enduring problems entrenched in the logic of capitalism, like inequality, alienation, exploitation, lack of democracy, periodic economic crashes, class domination, etc., cannot rely on merely changing the individuals operating the capitalist state, thinking that individual class identity and good political intentions are enough to address the problem. We can't put all our faith in electing a new government. The ship of capitalism will continue to cruise the Earth's sea and damage it along the way, regardless of who is manning the helm, so long as its underlying nuts and bolts are left intact. The real task is to change the very structures of the state and of society. This is why in State and Revolution, Lenin called for smashing the capitalist state, and rebuilding a new state suited for a different mode of production. But this doesn't mean that a new mode of production can be transitioned to immediately. It will likely be gradual. And this does not necessarily mean that the electoral road to socialism is entirely impossible, but rather that once a socialist or communist or anti-capitalist party is in power, regardless if by election or through other means, it will have to dramatically reshape the system, create a new constitution and a new legal code, not just making little shifts to it and changing some things around. It would be a serious error to base a socialist political project on the mere presence of the dominated classes within the state without a radical transformation of the state. Obviously, if we could just reform the system, things would be a lot easier. I think all of us would prefer that. This is what we would wish to be true. The case against capitalism isn't merely one of preference, but one of a necessity. For more on this topic, I recommend reading the book titled Socialism or Extinction by Ted Rees. I did a podcast interview with him, which you can find in the link below. Questions of how exactly capitalist structures can be replaced and what socialist structures ought to look like are crucial questions far beyond the scope of this video, and this will be part of an entire video series that I intend to make. For now, I can only leave you with a few recommendations, such as the books How to Be an Anti-Capitalist in the 21st Century and Proposals for a Democratic Economy by the Marxist theorist Eric Olin Wright. There's also Towards New Socialism by Paul Cockshott and No Bosses by Michael Albert. I've been increasingly doing conversations on post-capitalist alternatives on the One Dime Radio podcast and the extra podcasts that you get by becoming a patron. This video and all One Dime videos are made possible by the support of my patrons on Patreon. Much of what I earn on Patreon is reinvested right back into the channel. Because of you guys, I've been able to upload more frequently by working alongside an editor. Thank you very, very much to the patrons who have supported me thus far, especially these generous individuals.
Called Mouse Land. Mouse Land was a place where all the little mice lived and played, were born and died, and they lived much as you and I do. They even had a parliament. Every 4 years they had an election. They used to walk to the polls and cast their ballot. They passed good laws, that is, laws that were good for cats. But the laws that were good for cats weren't very good for mice.